Well, welcome to the Structural Modeling Video Conference for April 18th, 2020. Kevin and I will continue leading the discussion on group inquiry methods. That will include recap a little bit of what we talked about a couple weeks ago, and also then a segue into the ocean literacy and how these things would apply in that kind of arena. So turn it over to you, Kevin.
Okay, welcome. So we were talking about a project to enlist or engage the realm of system science to be at a better service of systems engineering. And this is a discussion that's been going on for, I guess, 8 years or 10 years maybe, between the ISSS and INCOSE, that's the International System Science Society, and the National Council on Systems Engineering. And so there was interest in whether we could use structured dialogic design, specifically interpretive structural modeling as part of that. And so we began a discussion last week of how do you go about designing such an application? And one of the things that initiates such a dialogue is referred to as a triggering question. That's a term ginned up by some combination of Warfield, Christakis, and Hassan Ozbakan. It's not a good word anymore because the word triggering has too many connotations. I like starting question or opening question better, but that's what we started with last week. Let's take a quick look at it without getting into the details of any specific statement. Let's look kind of like from a helicopter level, how that dialogue transpired. So we started, as you recall, with a diagram that had been developed by this liaison between ISSS and INCOSE back in, I think, 2012. Janet Singer, I think, was involved with that, and others. And we showed that diagram, and it was very kind of blurry, kind of not quite a Venn diagram, but kind of that level of ambiguity. And we used that as the impetus to think about how would we ask about this question. So I suggested kind of a broken up question. I was muddling through, and that's actually an interviewing technique. Without me stating the question, you kind of invite people to help you state it. That's just one technique, and someone jumped in, and the first question became, what must be done to empower system science to better serve systems engineering? And how can we do a better job at system science? So that was switching from the interface of the science to the engineering to kind of a complaint that system science hasn't done a good enough job by itself. And then whether system science was even a science, or is it a discipline or a field? And then how is the whole community of system science operate? And there was the metaphor of an enterprise introduced by a fellow that was, I think he's in France and works for Boeing, and he wants to think of, he was actually proposing systems engineering model for treating system science as an enterprise that would in turn serve systems engineering. So that's a circularity. It's sometimes referred to as the round trip problem in computer science, and it's kind of a test to see if you have a logically comprehensive system. I won't get into completeness and consistency because then we have to revisit Kurt Gödel's paradox. But yeah, so there's this is the side two things here. A metaphor was introduced of the enterprise, and then this implied circularity that we should be able to use systems engineer if our whole system is completely comprehensive. Let's say we should be able to use systems engineering to improve system science on behalf of systems engineering, and that circularity is also, of course, reflected in Ed Schein and the people that did double loop learning, the Cambridge folks. The second name escapes me at the moment, starts with an A. But it's also the idea of American pragmatism, that you have some science and then you have applications. In this case, engineering is the stand-in for the application world. You collect up evidence and you improve the science, or so-called foundations. Then the notion of a foundation is also a metaphor, and that came up as a discussion as well. Then there was a kind of a switchback. What if we just take what's already known from system science and make it more accessible to engineers? There was a notion of a voice. That's a metaphor, one clear voice. There's a related idea at the beginning of fields and structured dialogue over the decades. The Warfield Christakis camp has always been almost all the applications are at the beginning of a new field that has not been codified yet, like patient safety back in the 90s. There was no clear field. There was a dozen different disciplines doing things from different approaches, like the study of why do doctors have bad handwriting and it leads to such a high mistake rate in the number of in the amount of drugs that are given to people, sometimes off by an order of magnitude, and it killing people, and that the legal system protects them from that. Why? And the insurance company reinforces the legal protection and so forth. So what is that study? Is that a legal study? Is that a cognitive study? Is it a work process flow study? Is it lexicography, or whatever they call the study of handwriting? I mean, it's not the study of medicine. You know, it's a kind of a strange branch of medicine. It's like the sociology of medicine. So, for example, I did work in violence prevention in downtown Boston, the urban schools, and the teenagers felt they weren't able to raise their opinion to complain about how the schools were being administered. And the word that became common was teen voice, something like that. And so this is another metaphor that comes about when we invoke it kind of subconsciously when a new field is coming together. And I think it's also reflected in Thomas Kuhn's definition of a science, that a science emerges. He has like 7 conditions. And one of them is that there's an agreed upon problem, but the second major thing is they develop a common language. And so one clear voice has implications into the philosophy of science, but also as a metaphor. And then we hear this next one. Oh, I haven't shared the screen, have I?
That's true. You have not.
Apologize for that.
That's okay.
Okay. Okay, can you see the questions?
Yes, I can.
Okay. Right, so we had what must be done to empower system science to better serve systems engineering. How can we do a better job at system science? So we're switching down to where the focus of the difficulty is. Then definitions of science, discipline, field of endeavor. introduction of a metaphor, an organizing metaphor such as enterprise, talking more about the community. That kind of, although they weren't deliberately invoking it in that case, I believe it also, if Warfield was looking at that, he would say, well, that's what Charles Sanders Peirce is talking about in talking about the community of science. You can't have science without a community of science. Then the introduction of the notion of a voice, bringing a voice to that community, is something that is often done at the beginning of new endeavors like this might be, although system science has been around 80 years. And I think Kuhn used to say it took about 50 years for anything to become a science. Warfield used to say that too. It takes about 50 years for a field to become a discipline and then a science. We've been going like almost 80 years. So to say we don't really have that yet is kind of a statement that it's in disarray of sorts, but it is also a conflict between people that think system science itself is in disarray versus it's just not accessible to systems engineers because they're either not well read or the field is not well organized, or journals force fragmentation because it keeps forcing specialization and differentiation. It doesn't force coherence because you don't get extra points if you have multiple authors. You get more points if you're an individual author with a unique idea, and even rebranding ideas with new names often happens in system science. New metaphors get you a new journal article title. So here we were, we brought us to Peter talking about an analogy of whether we did this kind of major organization in a subdomain of system science, like ocean science or ocean literacy. And he borrowed this idea of, if it's really going to become a science, then it should become part of the curriculum. And so an appropriate question is to ask, what should you know by the time you graduate high school? So that's an analogy to organization that's been done in another realm. And I'd say, you could say another analogy along those lines would be how climate change science was brought together to the point that I think there was one journal article in Nature that had over 2,000 authors, something like that. So that's an analogy of something that, if we don't know how to do it, instead of planning how to do it, let's look at how another realm of science did it that was at the beginning of becoming a science, or had been around for a few decades and really needed to finally get organized. And so the climate change situation is a good example of that. And I think Bruno Latour, the sociologist out of France, has done a good job of studying the actual processes that happen in contrast to what people espouse happens when you try to coordinate an emerging science. And then we started into, we drifted off working on the questions, and there were other discussions of constituent metaphors, such as the notion of the foundation, and that there are different approaches to defining a science. Some, like foundations, people say, what are the principles? What are the axioms? Another approach, in contrast to that, is the notion of exemplars. This was raised by Tom as an early model of so-called gentleman science. A lot of that was around what they called natural history at the time, which later named biology, and so forth. And so I'm going to suggest that Peter, are you there, Peter? Let me see.
Yeah, I'm here. Yeah.
I thought we might talk a little bit about your initiative as an exemplar or an analogy to how we might pursue it. And after you describe it a little bit and we talk about that, I would then go into a discussion of application structural types that might be applicable. Your site is oceanliteracy.org.
Yeah, oceanliteracy.net.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I wanted to pull up that diagram. So how did that project get going?
Well, it started way back in the 90s, but came to a level of fruition that in 2000, the National Geographic, who has been trying to promote geography, wanted to get ocean content used as a way to teach geography, which we did. Identified a number of ocean topics that can be used in geography. This came about because there was a feeling that nobody was learning about the ocean, or very few students were learning about the ocean. And the desire was to get ocean used as a topic to teach science in schools in the United States. And in order to do that, there had to be agreement between the various disciplines of ocean science, of which there are many, about what's important, because that had never been agreed to. So a task was to get ocean scientists to agree on what a definition of ocean literacy meant, and then what 7 key principles are that they felt that every student should know by the time they graduated from high school. And then to support those principles, a number of concepts were elicited. And the diagram that you're looking at there is an evolution of the project to include what's called a scope and sequence, that under each one of the principles and the concepts are a number of smaller segments of learning nuggets or pieces, about 720 actually, that are meant to be sequential and progressive, leading to a mastery of each principle. The process was somewhat, we made it up in a way. It was a combination of surveys. It was a compilation of previous work on what ocean literacy might be by about 4 or 5 different groups around the country. And it then the surveys and all that information were compiled into a set of suggested principles, which were then discussed in an online conference for 2 weeks, in an asynchronous conference. And it was discussive in nature. It didn't have any structural modeling or discipline in that way, except that we went linearly over 2 weeks by principle to discuss the wording and the way to pull it together. And then after that 2 weeks, that conference was summarized and a group meeting was held with about, and the conference was about 100 people selected by a committee of 4 people. I was one of them, that selected 50 ocean scientists, 50 ocean educators, and 50 government and policy people to come up with that document. So that's the model, in a sense, and that was in 2004, 2005, and it's now gone global because the work was recognized as being substantive and scientific and credible, and the desire is to do the same thing for system science. But the challenge is that system science is not a hard established science as ocean sciences or even earth sciences or even climate. All of these have done similar pieces of work. And so we've not been able to get to the same level of clarity and resolution, hence this conversation. Does that help?
Yes, yeah. And then there's, we just touched on it last time, that there's a disagreement of how to bring different models of what would constitute a system science together. So von Bertalanffy in the, I guess it's back in the 50s, you know, his vision was everything would be unified on a mathematical basis, because you saw his classic one was the logistics curve, or so-called growth curve. Starts out exponential, finishes off asymptotic, and it's a model of population studies, epidemics, predator-prey relationships, and so forth. And so he said that would, you know, the notion of a matrix, the matrix math was the model for doing that. And at that time, he was, I think it was, you have to correct my terminology, Joe. Was it the Laplacian or the Lagrangian, where you have a matrix of partials of part? Huh?
I'm not quite sure what you're talking about.
Yeah. So if you have a bunch of variables, and you take the partial differential of every variable with respect to every other variable as different cells in the matrix.
Yeah.
Right. That was von Bertalanffy's generalized model for studying things, even when you didn't know what the equation was yet.
Right, exactly. So what that is essentially, if you're working on the diagonal, what you're doing, and you're just collecting data like they were, and I'm trying to match it and come up with an equation, you're balancing the bias of whatever those variables are. And so essentially you can approach that from a number of different ways. So it's a fairly well understood technique now in data science.
Right.
And basically, if you have a lot of data and you want to take that data and you want to reduce it to some kind of model, or you have a classic model or some type of model framework, and then you want to determine what each one of the variables are, given your the mathematical characteristics of the matrix, if any of those objects on the diagonal become zero, your whole thing blows up, right? So that's why you want to make sure that you have a reasonable, well-justified range, even a small range of bias across there. So I don't know if that made any sense, but
yeah, no, it does.
Kevin?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the Jacobian. You were
the
on the right track.
Jacobian. Thank you, Janet. So, Peter, could you say a little bit about what is the 720 elements? Is that, or that curriculum elements?
Yeah, they're curriculum elements. I mean, if you've got that up on the website there, you could click, I mean, for a simple one, just click the K through 12 on principle 1, K through 2 on the, there you go. Yeah, just
K through 2?
K through 2. Yeah, it's just because that's a simple example. And then you see, so that's the principle. There's only one ocean, and it's broken down into 4 subsets and features, and each one of those then is a sort of a learning piece. And then if you just go back to the diagram and click on the 9 through 12, just go back and click on 9 through 12, you'll see that is built out in a much more, detailed framework. And that's what is expected, that someone who is graduating from high school would know about the ocean that is related to that first principle. Yeah. And so the desire is that, is it possible to come up with 7 principles of system science that every student should know when they leave high school, and what would be the supporting concepts, and then what would be the learning progressions in a similar fashion. So that's the model. Now, we have looked to the cross-cutting concepts of the next generation science standards, which have 7 of them, but they are, although they have words that are connected perhaps to systems science in some respects, words like patterns and system models, when you look in closer examination, the way they're structured is, I mean, the first one for kindergarten is a cause and effect, and it's a very reductionistic, linear expression in many respects. And even the term system and system models does not really get at the richness of system science at all. It just talks about parts making up a whole. So there's, this incredible richness of 65 years plus a few thousand of systems work that we are wishing to represent in that way and make more current. And so that's where those elements come from. Or that's why that diagram was developed. And again, that was a further project that was developed with, again, about 50 people in a room for 3 days, 4 days, pulling that lot together.
Right. So what I know, when I had talked to you about this one-on-one, I think it was maybe 5-6 months ago, I just was making the observation that most all of the connections here follow kind of an Aristotelian hierarchy, that there's no crossovers.
Right. So I'm not saying that this is necessarily an ideal either, because, for that reason, there was attempts to make crossovers. Certainly, there's a top to bottomness about this, and there is a little bit of a left to rightness about it. And there is an attempt to make connections between principles. But I mean, I have a number of colleagues who've complained about this as being far too prescriptive and not exploratory, and not based on a constructivist view that you start where someone is and build out from their interest and their understanding. So,
right, but it's a good piece of work, and it serves to to give us a basis for kind of estimating or planning how to do it in for system science.
Exactly. Well, that's the idea. That's how I got into this, and that's what Janet and I and many others have been talking about for 4.5 years here, and we're at the point where we would like to have a little bit more resolution, for want of a better term. I mean, there have been other systems literacy activities, but none in the same sort of collaborative way that the ocean work was done and the subsequent work. And so, anything we can do here would be a good step forward.
Right. So, an advantage of having, employed this implicit hierarchy is you minimize the time of asking about all of the cross connections, which can take a lot of time. So this is, I think, would be closer to what Warfield would call a curriculum structure. It's like the outline of a big textbook.
Yeah, it is. That's exactly what it's meant for. Yeah.
So that's kind of the minimal time. Like if you wanted to economize on people's time, that's a structure that takes the minimal amount of.
Yeah, and teachers don't have much time, and they've got so many constraints that this was meant to be helpful to teachers.
Right. So when you when you're planning, so I just want to step back. We started last week just talking about the triggering question, and then trying to explore the systems boundaries of what we were talking about. And now we're talking about what are the types of structures of interest here. This is one model of a type of structure, an application structural type. Interestingly, the interpretive structural modeling software that has been produced, I think almost every version of ISM doesn't have a switch to let you just do this, right? because it's set up to explore all the potential combinations, and then it rules out those combinations that can be inferred by transitivity. But it's exploring, if there's, let's say, these 720 things, would you say they're individual concepts, the 720 elements?
Well, it's a mix, isn't it? I mean, I haven't looked at it with that lens. Some are individual, some are part, whole. I mean, difficult to categorize.
Yeah, so there's all different kinds of relationships. So there's part-whole relationships. There may be causative relationships, influence, concept maps, or learning. You said there's kind of a learning hierarchy first.
Yeah, it is. And I mean, even the seventh principle was added on at the end, and it's more of a statement of, it's not a scientific statement. It was a statement that says the ocean is largely unexplored. That's very different than an ocean physical statement that says there's only one ocean with many basins.
Right.
Right.
So there's different types of structures that you can explore in something like this. This is a specific, let's say a system science for the specific domain of oceans. And when you're trying to estimate or plan out a project, you need to have either a sense of how many people are going to be involved, and how big the domain of consideration is. Let's say, on the one hand, the domain is 7 principles, and if you were going to explore, let's say maybe they're not independent principles, I don't know, but if we were going to explore the potential interdependence, if you did it exhaustively, you'd explore 7 times 7, 49, minus 7 down the diagonal, because we don't ask about something with respect to itself. So you'd have 42 questions to ask. And with ISM, interpretive structural modeling, because of transitive inference, you cut that amount of time down. And the interesting thing is it's scalable. So as the number of elements goes up, the amount of time savings also goes up. So if you're exploring, for example, the relationship of a dozen things with respect to each other, so something around 130 questions, you only have to ask about 30% of that number, maybe 50 questions. If you are asking about the relationship of 20 elements with respect to each other, that's 20 times 2400 minus the 2380. And as it grows, for about 20 elements, ISM reduces 85% of the questions. Now, if you get much bigger than 20, this becomes, a time management issue. And for example, when quality function deployment was introduced from Japan into the auto industry as a way to do TQM in design, they had the big matrix, but they didn't have an algorithm for doing the transitive inference. So they were methodically filling out the matrix. In the case of Ford, there's a classic case study that Ford was doing the quality function deployment matrix for a car door, and there were 300 requirements. And they were going through and filling out 300 times 300 cells. And it was taking a team of half a dozen people 3 months of consistently confirming a relationship or not. And the reason that you do that is so-called forced juxtaposition. It makes you think of relationships of things you never thought about before, if it is the case that in that domain, potential interactions that you haven't accounted for may lead to unintended consequences, such as quality issues. So Ford was committed to doing it, but Ford, Hewlett-Packard, Digital Equipment, all the big companies that were trying to do this were complaining about how time-intensive and expensive it was. And that's how ISM got reintroduced to Ford. And then Warfield, there's a whole long series of years of correspondence between Warfield and the Harvard Business Review complaining that they didn't give him credit for introducing the whole idea of unified program planning to Japan in the first place, specifically at the plant that it came out later as quality function deployment. Anyway, ISM was a solution to this, and it's why Ford became Warfield's biggest research sponsor, and they set up a realm to do that. Anyway, in Warfield's Societal Systems book back from '76, he put an estimate based on the applications he was doing called he was calling it interactive management at the time. He did curve fitting to how much time a session would take as a function of the number of elements in the matrix to explore, the number of potential variables, and the number of people, right? So, excuse me, right? So the number of questions that you ask goes up as a square. It goes up as an exponential because it's a matrix, but it doesn't go up that fast as a function of the number of people that are involved. It slowly increases, and as you add more and more people, it does not follow the guideline that if you ask 100 engineers the same question, you get 100 different answers. That's a nice cliche, but it's not true. And the work about that started with something called Zipf's law, and there's work on that as you add more and more people, even if you ask each of them to contribute ideas until they run out of ideas, the number of unique ideas does not continue to grow. It grows asymptotically, and it levels off, and it becomes more and more expensive. You have to get more and more people to find even a single new idea. So there's a bunch of research about this letter P and E, and P as a function. E as a function of P, and it's found to tends to be domain specific. But as a rule of thumb, if you work based on marketing research in Japan on how many customers do you have to ask about their requirements to get all the requirements. If you ask about 10 people, you do thorough interviews with them, you'll get about 70% of requirements. If you ask 20 people, you get about 85%. Also kind of follows the Pareto rule. So this is if you're treating the domain that you're going to explore, such as they did in the ocean literacy project, as one big matrix. And if it's the case that there are, just for discussion purposes, there are 720 concepts, and you want to talk about the potential interrelationship to develop a concept map rather than a curriculum structure, then you have a 700 by 700 matrix to explore. So that's going to be 490,000 cells or questions to ask. And even if ISM gets rid of 90% of them, you have a project that's going on for months and months and months, right? So a way to avoid that cost and an endless project is to modularize it. Say, first we're going to do it by grade level, or we're going to do it by type of ocean species, or we're going to do it just by principle. And you cut these things, you modularize them somehow. And then what you have is this formula multiplied, not multiplied, but added up multiple times for different substructures. So I want to show you, I was going through some old notes. Can you see this new pen and ink equation?
Yes.
Yeah. So I had, when I worked for CWA, which was Christakis's company down in Pennsylvania, I asked that the secretary is very good at keeping all the records of all the projects, and she had all of the financial interactions with all the clients in the history of the company. And there's like, I don't know, 10 years of applications. And so I looked at each project. I took the report from the project and counted the number of people that were participants and the number of facilitators that were on the facilitation team. And so in this formula, P is the number of people. And C here, C min, that's the cost model. So this is a cost model. It's kind of activity-based costing model of doing structured dialogue. So I went through all the reports, got the number of participants, the number of facilitators, and then how much they charge. But since that changes over time, the stand-in for that is simply the number of facilitator days. And then L here, can you see the cursor?
Yes, I can see it.
Okay. So here, L is the success level, which goes from 2 to 5. That's a Warfield success level. So 1, success level 1, you recognize there's an issue. 2, you define, I don't remember exactly. It's something like 2, you define the problem. That would be a problematique. Or that might be 2 or 3, I can't remember. Then the next level is you define the option fields of solutions. And finally, level 5, you develop an action plan. So I categorized each of the projects according to their success, the Warfield success level. That's L, it's up here. And so if you're estimating how many facilitator days you need, if you do a problematique and an options field and an action plan, so that's adding more and more independent applications. So you have, the problematique is one iteration of this. This applies to the problematique, where E is the number of problems. Then if you're going to do an options field, that actually follows the type of hierarchy model that Peter was outlining, because you don't necessarily look at the cross connections. You just develop things into clusters, which is the growth rate of inquiry is about the same as the type of hierarchy model in Peter's effort here. And so when you go, so it's less than this. This is not the equation for that, but it's less. And then if you do the action plan, that is this model again. So you have an action plan. Now, if you do cross connections of the solutions to the problematique, then you have another equation about how long you can estimate that's going to take. So anyway, without getting too much into this equation, you see in the middle here, we have P is the number of people, P minus 12. So yeah, I found that it was helpful to think of how big a group is in terms of groups of 12, because when you get more than 12 people in the room, you have to add on another facilitator. And it seemed to be about every 12 participants, you had to add another facilitator. So that's where this equation comes from, P minus 12 over 3, the square root of that rounded up add two, because you always have to have at least a facilitator and someone running all the computers and the wall display and all of that. And so this was the formula of how many facilitators you need. This piece over here is how many days you need based on the, you're trying to do just a problematique, or a problematique and a solution and an action plan, or are you trying to do, say, a hierarchy model and a concept map or whatever. So this tells you how many days. This is how many people and so forth. So anyway, the next thing we're doing as we're asking the triggering question, to come back to that, and then I'll just open it up for general discussion. Is it possible to ask a single triggering question? Right, the triggering question is initiating the generation of the ideas. In Peter's case, 720 ideas were generated from I don't think there was a specific question. It was kind of an implicit question or tacit question. But now we want to say, is there just one structural type of interest here? I think from the types of questions, just the brief set of questions that we developed last time, there's more than one structure of interest to people. There's one interest in a mapping of system science actions to help systems engineering. Well, that implies maybe we need to know, what does systems engineering need from system science? What can system science do about it? That's at least two structures. So,
Kevin, I think in both cases, I think, well, what you brought up on the ocean literacy, the curriculum structure, I think it would be really fruitful for systems literacy and the system science, systems engineering question is sort of systems literacy for systems engineers. Now, that's not Gary's goal of wanting to engineer a whole discipline, but it's sort of what we've been working on with Peter.
Yeah, and it's practical too. I mean, it's actionable and it's realistic.
Yeah, so I think pursuing the curriculum structure, which I don't know a lot about, I think that would be really fruitful for the both of those areas. So anyway, I didn't want to interrupt you, but I also thought I was excited by the idea of the curriculum structure. I wanted to give you that feedback.
That curriculum structure is interesting. It's basically, what do you need? It's a sequence. What do you need to know before you're going to be able to prepare to learn thing A? What do you need to know? And so it's a judgment of what are the state. It's almost a state management thing of you as you're managing the state of a student. What do they need? What do they need to look like? What concepts do they need? Things like that. And so it's maybe that's something we can talk about next time.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Also think the ocean literacy is interesting because it's not focused on a specific relationship. The links between the nodes are not labeled.
right.
That's true.
It's kind of associational.
Yeah.
And so it'd be very difficult to do logic on that because there would be no indication that these are a consistent type of relationship that have a consistent set of logical properties.
And the other interesting observation about logical connection is that the definition of ocean literacy states that ocean literacy is an understanding of the ocean influence on you and your influence on the ocean. And then there is no easy way of showing the explicit connection between that definition and the first principle, apart from saying that that's what you should know. But in terms of influence, what is the relevance of knowing that there's only one ocean in terms of understanding the ocean's influence on you and your influence on the ocean? I mean, yes, you can make that connection, but that wasn't the logic flow that followed in the way that this was put together. As far as I can recall, interestingly, it was sort of more, we need a statement about ocean literacy, and then what is it that everybody needs to know?
Yeah, your first statement seems to be a system boundary definition.
Yeah.
And so once you're very, very high level, you say there's this one system that we're going to talk about, and we're going to decompose it.
Well, I mean, we thought about, using even the language. I explored that, being systems literate is understanding your influence on a system and the system's influence on you. Then you have to start talking about boundaries immediately.
For me, one of the boundaries, as I was reflecting a couple of weeks ago on our discussion, I felt that there's a need for a philosophy of science that you're going to invoke. And I don't think there's too many system scientists that were also philosophers of science. And as I mentioned last time, I don't think a lot of them were well read across philosophy of science. Most people invoke a particular favorite philosopher of science as the basis for what they.
Yeah, there are a number of people who would call themselves philosophers of science in the systems science community.
So they're going to have, I'm imagining they're not all of the same opinion or following the same philosophers of
Absolutely
science.
not. No, I mean, some of them are making up their own philosophy. Some are pulling from various philosophers. And of course, you've got, different philosophies coming from different parts of the world that are influencing the situation as well. So,
Right.
There's, as you mentioned already, American pragmatism and Peirce, and then you have sort of certain European traditions, and then the Eastern and Indian traditions as well, and they're all within the systems community. I hate to use the word competing, but they're all contributing strongly, right?
Well, I think
Chinese, Indian, European, Russian, so on and so on.
In the early days, Bertalanffy was well read. I think, didn't he his dissertation involved the work of Kant somehow, as I recall, and Rosen, Boulding, Churchman. Churchman taught philosophy in the philosophy department. Akoff. These people were all well versed in both science. I guess maybe in three fields: science, engineering, and philosophy. I think since then we've had more fragmentation where people have been in one field or another. I think actually what motivated the impetus for the field was people who were polymaths who saw the need. Warfield, for example.
Right.
So I think lately you have people who consider themselves philosophers, but they don't really know much about science or engineering. So it's really the need to bring together the multiple hats that's the challenge.
Right. So what occurred to me is there's a field that studies how to do that called qualitative research methods. Right? And you can employ structured dialogue and interpretive structural modeling in the service of doing, you're doing qualitative research across a diversity of stances or worldviews about what constitutes a system science or what constitutes a science at all, and then more specifically, is a system science somehow unified through mathematics, or is it simply the collection of all the subdomain system sciences like ocean literacy, or is it done through exemplars and so forth? That there's different models, and so there's a field that stands even outside science and system science that deals with how to triangulate between multiple perspectives like that. And, qualitative research methods is one, and that's what structured dialogue purports to do, but never tied themselves back to the theory of qualitative research, because qualitative research was being developed, starting to be developed at the same time as STD back in the 60s and 70s. And so that's another aspect to do.
Well, we've got about another 5 minutes left. So at this time, what would people like to do in our next session?
Well, I'd obviously like to move this along. I mean, I'd like to get to some actionable suggestions in terms of one thing Kevin and we have talked about in these sessions is how you might do this in an asynchronous or in a distributed fashion. Of course, that's even more important in the world today under the circumstances that we're all faced with. So, how could one indeed frame systems literacy as a requirement for understanding a post-COVID-19 sort of world, in a sense, or even a world where we're all wrestling with what the pandemic means. But if we had more systems literacy, would we be in a better position? And if so, what should that systems literacy be?
Okay, that sounds like a very good subject for our next meeting, next session, and also the idea of digging a little bit more into specifically what a curriculum structure is.
Yes, I think, I'm not sure that the COVID, like with the financial crisis and the bee die-off and climate change, all of these things bring up our awareness of interconnections and complexity, but I don't know if they really change anything fundamentally. We need to deal better with interconnections and complexity, interdependencies. But I like very much the idea of learning more about the curriculum structure, maybe looking at your ocean literacy curricula as an exemplar, so that we can get a sense of how that might be bootstrapped for systems literacy.
Another thing to keep in mind is we might start, rather than go after the whole grab onto the curriculum structure for system science or whatever you do in the domain. First, you could use structured dialogue to develop an action plan to do that. How are you going to do it?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, Kevin. I think Mary and I wrote a couple of papers that talked about the application structural types. So I think I'll probably use that, send that out as a basis. And then, so what that will do is not just focus on a curriculum structure, but it'll kind of give an overview of really what the developed application structural types are and what their purpose is, and expand it a little bit. So
yes, that's good. And obviously, so what you're saying now is that the application structural types complement one another, and we can think of all of them in this context.
Yeah, very helpful. Yeah, good idea.
Okay, great. Any other comments here in our last minute?
Thank you all very much again.
Oh yeah, well, it's very interesting. Very interesting. All right then. Well, we will do our next meeting on, let's see, the May the 2nd, it looks like. Yep, May the 2nd. So I'll send that out and kind of highlight the subjects. And Final opportunity for any comments here before we sign off for the day. All right, then. Thank you, Kevin. Appreciate it.
Okay, bye-bye.
See you, Tom.
Thanks, Tom.
Bye-bye.